Hi, my name is Brooke Adams, and this presentation summarizes my action research project on effectively teaching sight words to kindergarten students through a Tier 2 intervention. In my classroom, with the help of my administration and my reading coach, I identified a clear problem of practice. Kindergarten students were struggling to recognize sight words both in isolation and when applying them in decodable text, even though our Tier 1 instruction was being taught with fidelity. This was concerning because it was negatively impacting their reading fluency. On the pre-assessment that I gave, students scored an average of just 17.9% for accuracy of sight words. This showed a significant gap in their understanding. Addressing this problem is especially important because sight words make up 50 to 75% of the words a child reads. This means that when students are not automatic with sight words, it can significantly impact their overall reading development and ability to read fluently. After talking with my reading coach, we found that this is not only a kindergarten issue. This issue is also being found in first grade and second grade and even in the upper grades. This is why it was especially important to me to identify this problem and begin an intervention on it. My research question was developed based on classroom data and a review of existing research. Through my research, I found that orthographic mapping is a highly effective strategy for helping students store and recognize sight words by connecting sounds to letters. I also found that multisensory strategies increase student engagement and support retention. However, I identified a gap in the research. While there is strong support for these strategies in general reading instruction, there is limited research specifically focusing on using orthographic mapping and multisensory strategies within Tier 2 interventions for sight word development. Because of this gap, I developed the following research question. Will the orthographic mapping and multisensory strategies improve students' ability to recognize and apply sight words during Tier 2 intervention? To address this problem, I implemented a Tier 2 small group intervention during our school's Wildcat time. This intervention lasted for 6 weeks, with sessions taking place 3 days per week for 15 minutes. I worked with a group of 9 kindergarten students who were identified as struggling based on pre-assessment data, but also who had alphabetic knowledge to be able to effectively apply the orthographic mapping strategies. The focus of this intervention was on teaching sight words using orthographic mapping and multisensory strategies. During the intervention, I intentionally used the orthographic mapping and multisensory strategies. The orthographic mapping strategies focused on helping students build connections between sounds and letters. This included phoneme graphing mapping, where students connected individual sounds to specific letters, as well as phoneme tapping to segment words. Students also engaged in word building and writing to reinforce these connections and support long-term retention. In addition, I incorporated the multisensory strategies to increase engagement and support memory. These included activities like writing words and sand trays, tracing, and using body movements. These strategies allowed students to interact with words in multiple ways, which helped strengthen their learning. Finally, students applied their learning through sentence reading and writing, as well as practicing with decodable texts. This helped ensure that they were not only recognizing sight words in isolation, but also using them in context. To evaluate the effectiveness of this intervention, I used both qualitative and quantitative data, and I triangulated these data sources to strengthen the validity of my findings. For quantitative data, I used pre- and post-assessments that included 23 sight words along with progress monitoring checkpoints throughout the intervention. I also included an application-based assessment to ensure and to measure students' ability to use sight words in connected texts. For qualitative data, I collected weekly reflection logs. These allowed me to observe student engagement, behaviors, and confidence, and overall responsiveness of the intervention. By triangulating these data sources, I was able to confirm patterns in student growth across multiple measures. This helped ensure that the results were not based on a single data point, but instead reflected consistent improvement in both performance and student behaviors. This project took place over several months in the year of 2026. In January, I collected baseline data and began the intervention. During February and March, I continued implementing the intervention and administered the progress monitoring assessments. And in April, I analyzed the data and reflected on the results of the study. Before the intervention began, I administered a pre-assessment to measure students' ability to recognize sight words in isolation. The data showed that students were performing significantly below expectations, with a class average of just 17.9%. This indicated that students were struggling with foundational sight word recognition, which is critical for reading development and reading fluency as well. Based on this data, it was clear that students needed targeted support in order to build their recognition skills before they could successfully apply those words in connected texts. During the intervention, I used progress monitoring to track how students were growing in their ability to recognize sight words and see if the treatment was being effective. The first checkpoint included 8 sight words, and the second checkpoint included 16 sight words. This followed the trajectory of the intervention as students were gradually introduced to more and more sight words using the treatment. After the first checkpoint, I saw a really big increase in scores. Students went from the very low baseline score to a much higher accuracy in a short amount of time. As the number of words increased in the second checkpoint, students continued to show growth even with added difficulty. This showed that students were not only improving, but they were also applying their learning as expectations increased. A formal pre-assessment for application was not administered because baseline recognition data indicated that students were not yet able to identify sight words in isolation. Since recognition is a foundational skill, instruction was first focused on building that ability before assessing the application of the sight words. Once students showed growth in recognition, an application assessment was administered to determine whether students could transfer their learning to connected texts. The results showed an average of approximately 88%, in indicating that students were able to successfully apply the sight words within the sentences. This suggests that as recognition improved, students were also able to transfer those skills into authentic reading tasks. Post-assessment data shows significant growth in both recognition and application. Students improved from a pre-assessment average of 17.9% to over 90% in both recognition and application. This represents a growth of approximately 75 percentage points. These results indicate not only mastery of sight word recognition, but also the ability to apply those sight words within text. Overall, the data suggests that the use of orthographic mapping and multisensory strategies was highly effective in improving students' outcomes with sight word retention and application. In addition to quantitative data, qualitative observations provided important insights into student growth. Over time, students became more confident and responded more quickly when identifying sight words. They required less prompting and demonstrated higher levels of independence. Engagement was especially high during the multisensory activities, which seemed to support both motivation and the retention of sight words. While the results of this intervention were strong, there were still several challenges that impacted both instruction and student performance. One major challenge was that students often confused visually and phonetically similar words, such as what with want, with went. These errors show that while students were developing sight word recognition, they were still refining their understanding of orthographic patterns and how similar words differ. This makes sense as these students are still also learning to spell phonetically as well. Another challenge was related to the implementation. Because this intervention took place during a 15-minute Tier 2 block, instructional time was limited. Additionally, some students had inconsistent attendance, which affected their exposure to the intervention. Student behaviors also played a role. As students became more confident, some began rushing through their task, which led to errors. However, many of these errors were self-corrected, which still demonstrated growth in their understanding. I also noticed that engagement was the highest during multisensory activities, while more repetitive or worksheet-based tasks led sometimes to a decreased focus. These challenges informed my instructional decisions throughout the intervention. I adjusted pacing, incorporated more review when needed, and prioritized multisensory strategies to maintain engagement and support retention. Overall, this intervention was carried out as planned, with consistent small group instruction and ongoing data collection. This allowed me to closely monitor student progress and make informed instructional decisions. As I analyzed the data, I made the adjustments to better support student learning. I modified pacing when students needed more time to master specific words and increased the use of the multisensory strategies to maintain engagement and strengthen retention. There were also challenges that impacted the process. Attendance affected consistency for some students, and the limited time frame required intentional planning. In addition, students continued to show confusion with similar words, which required a targeted review and reinforcement. Despite these challenges, the results were still very strong. Students demonstrated significant growth in both sight word recognition and the application of those sight words. They also showed increased confidence and independence throughout the intervention. Overall, the project highlights how ongoing data analysis and instructional adjustments can lead to meaningful improvements in student learning. If I were to conduct this study again or just implement this intervention in the future, I would incorporate more of the hands-on pieces and reduce the repetitive task. I would also include additional data sources such as the STAR assessment data to further monitor student growth and strengthen the findings of the study. After completing the intervention, I found that through the STAR assessment, I could have looked at one specific standard, which is the sight word standard for kindergarten, and I could have seen how students were performing prior to the intervention and after the intervention. However, I did not know that I could use this until after I completed my intervention. So going forward, if I were to do this again, I would like to see how that data was changed by this intervention. In conclusion, the use of orthographic mapping combined with multisensory strategies was highly effective. Students showed significant improvement in both recognizing and applying sight words. They also demonstrated increased confidence and independence, which are critical for long-term reading success.